Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice, Dantak.
What a game.
Okay, lay out how this works. What did we see?
So we got to see around 2 hours of gameplay, and play around 2 hours of gameplay in one of the new areas, the Samurai Residence or Hirata Estates, depending on whatever you want to call it.
They say the final word is Hirata Estates, so we'll go with that.
So it's a zone that is outside of the main gameplay area that you access via memories. This is not completely uncommon in a From Software action RPG, where there's some things that's sort of disconnected from the vast interconnected world that you go to in some kind of like transformative way. So this is like, we got to see the area front to back, all the way from the beginning to the final boss of the zone. In a very typical fog gates and everything, very structured, they've got that structure down. But the differences also during the play experience were very significant while retaining that core. So that was pretty impressive, actually, as a Souls fan. So like, as a Souls fan, I'm sold already, right? Like,
Were you sold ahead of time though?
There's so much talk about how different it is, and
Yes.
there is, and it's something we should talk about. But at the same time, those core sensibilities are definitely there. Like a Souls player is going to be like, yeah, they're going to have to adjust, just like Bloodborne.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to have, there's definite adjustments you need to make, which take time. But the core is there, and then they just do all kinds of fun stuff with it in regards to traversal and playing around with some of the core concepts of what makes a From Software action RPG work.
Yeah, I feel like we should zoom out a little bit. So
Zoom out.
Three of us, if listeners of the podcast remember when Andy McNamara hosted an episode, I guess it was like early December, right?
Late November, yeah.
Yeah, that's when the three of us, we flew to Tokyo and visited From Software, spent 2 days at the studio talking to developers, playing the game, like you mentioned, a lot of fun stuff like that.
We got to talk to Miyazaki, always a blast.
It was fun, yeah. Less time than we talked to him last time. The Dark Souls 3 trip was a very interesting trip we've talked about before. We've written about it in the magazine.
Well, it was very interesting because, we had to talk to him for longer last time as there was nothing else.
It was a weird miscommunication.
That was the story.
Yes, and this time it was lovely to see him again.
I agree.
But, okay, so let's just start big takeaways. It seemed like the big takeaway that you had was, there's still basically progression in this game. Like all that they've done of beating the drum of like, it's completely different.
Okay.
Don't expect Dark Souls, I feel like you left saying, it is more Dark Souls than I expected.
It is very different, but it's still, like, it's probably the most divergent they've done. So even more so than Bloodborne. But those core concepts are still there. And yes, so there's no like stats or anything, but the progression system is there. So you're going to go out and kill enemies. You get experience points. You get skill points that you put into skill trees. You are progressing. You're getting your character stronger. And a lot of the stuff that we saw, those abilities translate into something that you could get in a Souls game, like enhanced healing on your Estus flask, which is now the healing gourd. But it's an Estus flask, right?
Right.
So a lot of those core concepts are there, but the cool new stuff on top is definitely different and definitely feels different to play and do. Two most important ones. Outside of, we can talk about progression. Do you want to stick on progression right now?
I like progression. I think it's interesting.
All right, so let's tackle progression first.
Please.
So you've got coins, these are sort of like we didn't see any real permanent progression from the coins, but I bet they're used in like the crafting, which is another part of the permanent progression.
There's a lot to talk about here.
Crafting your prosthetics, right? So you can find these prosthetics out in the world, like items, like you'd find a weapon in Souls or something, and they can be modified by finding crafting materials and having the sculptor transform them into a new item. So like with the very basic example is a shuriken toss, throws a shuriken. That's cool. It's good. It's very useful, especially since it can hit targets that are like running or flying. I know we didn't see any flying targets, but that's going to be an interesting one for sure. You can upgrade that to shoot multiple shurikens and stuff like that. And all of them have different upgrades you can get. So you're getting stronger, even though a big point of contention was that, your weapon is going to be the katana. That's true. You're using that the whole way through. So that's something you're going to get used to over the course of the game. But you won't be able to make yourself a giant ironclad knight or a caster or some combination of roguey caster or any of the stuff you can do in Souls. You're playing as Sekiro, all right? You're playing as him, period. But there's still ways to upgrade and sort of manipulate your character in different directions. So you can make your guy a little tankier, make your guy a little stronger in another way, and they're not capped. So you can't. So like if you say I want to play more like a samurai, I want to play like a shinobi, I want to be more stealthy. You can take all these stuff, assuming you get the experience points.
It's more of an action game in that sense. It feels a lot less like an RPG, but they're basically saying like how much of the RPG trappings of what we've done before can we shed and still make this a From game. So like there is still that progression, but it's more in the style of an action game where instead of like speccing to a different build, you're sort of just unlocking new abilities and they can more readily count on you having those abilities when they're making the environments and the bosses and things like that.
Which is one thing they brought up, like, oh, we can make our bosses more extreme, our maps more extreme, because we don't have to take everything into account. And the environments in particular, like, we don't have to worry about people breaking this in co-op, some crazy exploits.
Right.
So that's why we can be a little bit more exaggerated.
So one thing to point out is that the game doesn't have online, as far as we know.
Right.
And so like they mentioned that this basically lets us say like, well, in some cases we had to design the maps around the fact that there could be two players and how might they exploit this sort of particular area.
Exactly.
And so they don't have to worry about that as much with Sekiro because you can just pause.
You can pause.
Right.
Sure.
And which I mean, you got in the Switch version of Dark Souls, sort of.
Oh, interesting.
But
Okay.
here, like straight up in the middle of a fight, you can pause, switch your inventory out, and have a new thing. Which they really want you to sort of keep your sort of the different aspects of your arsenal in mind because you have quicker access to them. You can say, okay, here's an enemy that I can't figure out how to beat. Oh, I must have a tool already in my arsenal versus like, well, I guess I just I'm gonna have to find a way to brute force this with my build. Versus like, oh, I have this thing that I can use to more readily, like an axe that I can use to break this guy's shield.
Right.
Right. So, in previous From Software action RPGs, you'd have to take a different style for your boss depending on your build. In this one, you're pretty much going to be doing the same stuff, and you're going to try to figure out what you've got in your arsenal to beat that boss.
Yeah, it always feels like you're equipped enough to take on the boss versus like this boss is going to really frustrate this particular style of player.
I don't know, because I saw Dan Tack for like an hour go up against this drunkard character, and I don't think he had what it takes.
Yeah, and what it took, what it would have taken to help, I never got to fight him after I acquired it, but the axe. So we're speaking of prosthetics now. These can offer immense differences in the situations. Like they're in that fight, I don't know, Juzu the drunkard or whatever his name was.
You've seen him in trailers. Like he's the big guy. Yeah. He pukes all over the place. He's a cool guy.
He's very dangerous. You can find out tons more about this in the issue, by the way, which you should check out because we're only going to cover the surface stuff here. So when you fight him, he's got tons of extra enemies during that fight. He's got a couple of fire archers, and the most annoying ones he's got are these two little shield guys, which are extremely difficult to take out without the axe prosthetic, which shatters shields. So you've got sort of paper, rock, scissors solutions to different problems. Enemies with glowing red eyes, for instance, are very susceptible to the flame vent tool. So you've got all these different kinds of tools that you can use depending on the situation. You can get creative with them too. Like the axe isn't just for breaking shields. It's also like a very slow, hard-hitting, posture-breaking hit. Very, the Kirk hammer in Bloodborne would be a similar allusion here.
Right.
So you've got that in your arsenal. The more stuff you get in your arsenal, the more stuff you can do, and the more situations you can take on. So that's very helpful. And it should also be we sequence broke to get to the drunkard. There was another guy who, it was an accidental sequence break. I was just wandering on the level because that's another thing. Are we ready to talk about traversal here? Because it's a big deal.
Sure. You're talking about you stumbled across the Ninja Hunter?
You're right. So the Ninja Hunter was sort of the way I was supposed to go.
Okay.
And because you can swim in this game, that's a first. You can swim, and more importantly, the grappling is crazy for traversal, and the stealth. Along with that is the stealth, right? These three things together make it already feel completely different. The grappling is nuts. Like a lot of times in Souls games, you've got they're sort of openish, but basically you're going through corridors, right? And you're getting ambushed by giant knights around every turn. Yeah. A lot of the time. In this one, you're actually doing the ambushing. You are going wherever you want in the zone within reason, and you can get the drop on enemies instead of them getting the drop on you. And it's actually sort of heavily implied that you better be doing that to make these fights even, because it's not an all stealth kind of experience like a straight up ninja game.
You're not going to be able to basically do a pacifist run of this game of I've snuck by everyone or I stealth killed everyone. It's you are using stealth as one of your tools in combat.
Mm-hmm. Right. Stealth is like a way to get the drop. Like let's say you're taking on 3 or 4 guys, you can maybe stealth kill 2 of them before you have to fight 2 of them, and that's going to make a big difference in the battle.
I think it also helps with sort of a lot of maybe what people find frustrating about these games is that there's a lot of learning through death of I ran around the corner and there was a guy. No way I could have foreseen that. So here you have more opportunities where you sort of grapple onto a tree and you can sort of see the entire area and sort of plan from there. And there aren't as many sort of surprise, we got you kind of encounters. You are the surprise in this case. You're sort of reversing that a little bit.
So you can hide along walls and you can hide in shrubbery and all kinds of stuff like that. It's very different from a Souls game in any perspective. And that's of course the enemies sort of have a detection meter on you, so you can see how much they're aware of your presence.
Also, one of my favorite moments when Dan was playing was there's giant like monster roosters.
There are.
In the Hirata states that just crow like madmen. It's kind of like a detection thing, I'd imagine. So there's this moment where Dan was like hiding on the roof trying to be a sneaky ninja as like 6 mutant roosters are just crowing their heads off around you. It's hilarious.
So that was actually like I had inadvertently stumped into the rooster pen. So this is a very interesting
trying
part.
to sneak through a rooster pen.
I think I snuck above it or something. But anyway, it was very interesting because like this game on the surface, this is just another takeaway here. On the surface, it appears very rooted in the Sengoku era.
Right.
Right. So like a lot of very samurais and ninjas, hardcore, just humanoid enemies, humans, people, history.
Right.
And then you got stuff like the mutant roosters and poison lizards and all this other crazy stuff. This game is going to go. This is going to be like.
There's going to be some wacky fantasy.
It's going to get
stuff later.
way wacky. It's going to go completely off the rails. I have no doubt. Like I have zero doubt about that.
There's a quote here. Oh gosh. Okay, so this is from Yasuhiro, I think, who's a marketing guy internal there at From, and he said, "It's a human drama, the game overall, but it's a From game. It's a Miyazaki game, so you can expect a lot of weirdness to occur."
Yeah. So the rooster pen was interesting. Yeah, those things were weird. And new.
And just like the setting overall for Hirata Estates, it's like the idea is that like there's bandits raiding this town. So as you go further in the
3
level,
years
the
in the
towns,
past. Yeah.
They're sort of raising this estate basically, and so you get to see some of the carnage as it's happening.
Right, and that's why they're all drunk, and that's why the huge drunkard guy is puking
Huge
all over
drunkard
the
guy's
place.
a serious deal, yeah.
For another one of those cases of like, well, it's kind of like bandits raiding a town in 1596 in Japan or whatever the official timestamp is. That is actually it. But then at the same time, it does become exaggerated like that with the roosters, with the weird pukey guy.
And let's not forget
lizards.
the big boss of the estates.
Right.
Yeah. Are we ready for? No, we can keep talking about lots of other stuff. Like we can go forever about this game.
Yeah, well, I mean, sort of the last thing that I think the other doubt that I think it kind of tempered was how linear it's going to be. So there is a hub called the Shina Outskirts, I think it's called.
That's right.
Where you sort of go between encounters and you can basically access it from any of the sculptor's idols, which are the bonfires, and you go there and you sort of upgrade. That's sort of where you upgrade your skill tree, things like that. There's a sort of a dummy character called the Immortal Soldier that you can sort of just practice your techniques on. But they mentioned that you're going to be trekking back and forth between different areas. It's not going to be like as open. It's not going to be like this sort of one world, sort of like Dark Souls. But there will be points where you'll get something in one area that'll let you sort of double back and progress in another area, sort of like a Metroid style kind of thing.
Yeah, and Miyazaki even said that this game, compared to other games' level of freedom, he said it's on the higher end of the spectrum.
He did. Those were his words.
He said compared to other games, especially at the midpoint, he says it really opens up in a big way.
Which is very exciting. That's really cool. Like I already got we got a little taste of that just in what we did there, because in most Dark Souls levels, it is a straight progression through the zone.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a detour, maybe there's like a secret boss or something, but it's usually, A to B within the confines of one area. But we went all over the place in the estates, and there's all kinds of stuff to see and do there that I'm sure even we missed. But we found different, like doubling back, we found like multiple prosthetic items. There's rosary beads, which are sort of like heart containers. They make you permanently stronger, so that's another form of progression. If you collect enough of them, you get better. You get more vitality and posture. So you're going to get.
There are reasons to explore these maps in a way that feels very From-esque, even if it is more of an action game.
Right. And Miyazaki said that was like the core idea of the game was the freedom of movement.
And
so
it's
they're
there.
really trying to take advantage of it with more extreme maps.
And it's very compared to their other titles. It is absolutely there. Like the grappling hook is something that took serious getting used to just off the bat, because it's just such an insane amount of freedom compared to what you've had in previous games. It's just like
keeping that stuff in mind was sort of one of the adjustments of like, I have the tools I need to deal with this, but I need to remember to use them.
Right. So I think for a lot of From Software fans, it's going to be sort of that Bloodborne style revelation that you do have to play differently, even though the roots feel the same. You're going to have to play substantially differently, like how I got stuck on Father Gascoigne. I was just like, what am I doing? What is this game? But inherently, a lot of the mechanics are transferable, but they require a change of play style.
And it seemed like the big thing for you after going up against this drunkard guy, just over and over again, Dan. It felt like a lifetime sitting in From
game.
Software.
First time playing, it's kind of...
Well, Surreal, on the other hand, here, picked up the controller out of the blue, took on the boss, beat it first shot.
And he did.
First shot.
I did watch Yasuhiro play through that boss.
First time touching the controller then. But anyways, Dan, it seemed like a takeaway was like, deflecting. That seems
deflection's
to be much more
be a
important
huge
than you
thing.
think.
But some aspect of deflection has always been important for me, whether it's parrying or timing your bullet shot in Bloodborne. getting the timing down on that mechanic will be very important to players, absolutely. And that's this like sort of clash of swords timing that it has. I think it'll be easier in this game than others because you've only got the one weapon. So you only need to learn how to time that thing. You don't need to learn how to time multiple different attacks and weapons. I mean, different attacks, sure.
Yeah.
You're going to pick up combat arts, but you want to learn like hammers and swords and catalysts and everything, all this other crazy stuff. You just need to learn how to use that weapon and time it.
Yeah. What stood out to you, Serial?
I think beyond sort of like the more open design, I think this was one thing that he mentioned was that the boss that we fought was the Butterfly Hag, or the Lady Butterfly, and she was this very agile, very nimble opponent that we've had sort of humanoid opponents in Souls games before, but most of them tend to abide by like, here's a big guy, you kind of like roll around them, sort of like try to figure out their weak points. But she was she was like a lot more aggressive in just moving around, constantly hopping on wires and stuff, throwing like shuriken at us. She felt like a more nimble opponent than we've had in the past.
Yeah. Also really into illusions.
Yeah. So like they mentioned that they're going to have what they call like a heat system or something where once you get a boss down to a certain health, they change stances, basically. They change phases, basically. And hers was sort of, she summoned these illusions that attacked you. And so, but you have an item called the snap seeds, I think, that you could use to dispel them. And you're going to get sort of some hints as to how to use sort of items to counter bosses, or, you know, any tricks that might work on them by exploring the world. And I think that's a pretty cool way to sort of say like, hey, maybe it's not as open-ended in terms of combat or in terms of like spec builds, but if you explore, and if like there will be different experiences based on how much you explore the world.
Yeah.
So during the Butterfly Hag fight, it was interesting because usually the heat up mechanic in other From Software games is like you get them down to half or 70% or whatever, and then they'll change their style. But see, this game is interesting and different because the opponents have lives just like you do with the resurrection mechanic. So once Suriel expended one of her lives, that's when she goes into the phase 2 and starts, you know, doing the illusions, which if you don't kill, which they actually turn into butterflies that she shoots at you at like light speed, and it's probably going to kill you. So you could take him out with the consumable, or you can try to beat him regularly. But it was an interesting mechanic. You know, the Witch of Hemwick also has illusions. That's something they've done before in Bloodborne, and we have fought nimble opponents too in the past. I don't know quite this nimble, but there are definitely some really fast critters.
3.
Yeah. Like fast humanoids are not, I don't think, completely new, but this fight, it was very stylized. It was what you expect from a From Software boss.
The burning
honestly.
room, everything. Well,
Yeah.
and Miyazaki even said that it came from his love of Basilisk,
Correct.
the anime.
Yeah. The
where he's like, I always wanted a
Grandma
ninja
Ninja.
granny. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So there we go.
And that was fascinating. Yeah.
It's also been like interesting to see how they've developed sort of the parry mechanic over the course. Where like this feels like the game where they are very explicitly telling you like parries are important. Make sure you like land those blows. Whereas in Bloodborne or even Dark Souls, like parrying a boss, you know, as rare as it was in Dark Souls, always felt like here's like a cheap trick that you can use. Versus this, they are building their encounter specifically around that mechanic, and you will like you can still attack them and they'll lose health, but it is so small the amount of health you are taking down from regular attacks that you basically have to parry these guys or you're not gonna. But you have to earn that parry. It's not just like you sneak up behind this person and then you stab them in the back and like, all right, I did it. You have to sort of earn those death blows by using the posture system, which is sort of gets you to rethink a little bit the combat encounters, in that if you're sort of trying to stay back and sort of watch their patterns after you've attacked them, they're going to regain that posture. So you have to be a lot more aggressive than you were even in Bloodborne.
Yeah, and the whole death blow thing, they said like, oh, it's from Tenchu. Like originally this was a Tenchu game,
Yeah.
and then at a certain point they realized like, their pitch was interesting, more interesting than I expected. Of like, yeah, people associate us with the Tenchu games. We just publish them. They're like, we never really developed the main Tenchu games, and so we didn't want to create one now and have it be a pale imitation of the previous Tenchu games. You know, it's like, okay, sure.
I mean, you could definitely feel that the Tenchu inspirations.
Well,
in
the
it, though. It's good
core
stuff.
design.
Yeah.
I mean, when they're starting to build out this game, they were designing it as a Tenchu game, so that's definitely still there.
So
Yeah.
like the parries do work differently than they have in Dark Souls, but like it is still one of those things where they want you to basically learn the timing versus like learning how to spec your character.
Yeah. Let's see. Other big takeaways. Story.
You can play it in English or Japanese.
That's very exciting.
So interestingly, there is a cohesive and understandable main story, which is interesting. But at the same time, there will still be, you know, From Software fans love to piece things together with those little lore tidbits. Those will still be there. So,
But they said that like it'll be about as many cutscenes as there are in a typical From game. But
yeah, because they were harping on story so much. I was really kind of worried about that, just for the hardcore fans, if they were going to be turned off by like, is this going to be a straightforward story where it's like the bond between the young lord and the shinobi? But they're like, no. Like the young lord, like it's not an escort mission. You have him in gameplay for one section. They said early on, and then after that, it's free form, and he's just like an NPC.
Right. So they took sort of the chance to make this specific character versus like a generic sort of create your own character. They're basically telling less story about the world and more story about like you in this world. It's more character. It's more slightly more character driven.
slightly.
Yeah.
But I was expecting much more, and then you see it, and it's like, okay, this is still a From game. Like it's at least the section that we saw.
There's still a lot of like reading into item descriptions, which Miyazaki is sort of taking a step back in that department. He's not writing them, like he's sort of delegating that task to other people on the team,
which is interesting overall. So yeah, he wrote the overall story, like the main plot of the game, but the actual like day-to-day writing, they have different writers working on that. And in our interview with him, he talked about how challenging it is for him to step back, and he had an interesting story about just like, yeah, it was so nice just to be sitting at home before, and I would just quickly write out the description of like, it's kind of like this. And now if he has an idea, an epiphany at night, then he goes back into the office the next day, he has to communicate it to the writers what he's going for. But so I think if you're interested in like Miyazaki working on this game in particular and his thoughts on the game overall, we have a full interview with him that we'll be posting, written only, because he will not allow video or audio of that human being to be released on planet Earth. But that'll be going up later in the month. I think it should be pretty juicy.
It's a good one.
Any other big takeaways? Like, do you think there's a world where Dark Souls fans are disappointed?
I don't think so. I mean, based on what we've played, I would say no. But there's a whole lot more game than the 2 hours, right?
Yeah. Right.
I mean, I can see sort of like some of the people who say like, I like to do a run as every kind of archetype in Dark Souls.
Right.
I can see that getting like those people being like, well, once you beat the game, you may or may not be already done with it. But I feel like if you like sort of the change from Dark Souls to Bloodborne, this feels a little bit more intense in that direction of like, we want to make better encounters by sort of streamlining them and saying like, you have fewer options, but we are going to tailor the encounters to what you have available.
So I'm a big fan of being able to do my own builds and all that kind of stuff. But I think this might be the perfect another like Bloodborne was an attempt that like it still got all that classic sensibilities, all the stuff that we love from those From games.
Right.
But you can't really screw up your character this time by building out like, what the hell was this adaptability stat? What do I need agility for? And putting all your points in the wrong places. You won't be able to do that really. Yeah. So that's a good plus for people who are trying to get into this.
Yeah, and it's not like. I think people will see this change and say, they're kind of dumbing things down. But I like that they're experimenting with that formula. I like that this isn't just like, well, we made another Dark Souls game and you still have all the same options available to you, and we just kind of remix the encounters.
They seemed excited about shaking things up. Miyazaki even made a reference to like, I don't want to beat a dead horse here. Like, we want to constantly reinvent ourselves to some extent. It seems like a good middle ground for that.
Because a lot of the fun in these games is sort of discovering sort of like the new differences. I remember like when Dark Souls 2 came out, people were kind of like, there's things work somewhat differently. Like when you first saw the Pursuer, it didn't amount to much, but it was like a very kind of different encounter. It's like, I just saw him and I didn't see him again. Or like enemies dying and then not coming back eventually. Like that kind of stuff is sort of the stuff that I think makes those games really cool. It's just like, I've never seen that before. And I think they're trying to do that again with Sekiro by saying like, you're gonna have to play combat differently and how that affects sort of
and you definitely
what you've come to know.
Right. And on the like more open front, more RPG focus, the Dark Souls angle, stuff like that, and the online front, Yasuhiro, the marketing guy, even said at a certain point, he said, we hope players look forward to something in the future where we might go back to that formula. But they're kind of in the mode of like, hey, let us experiment a little bit.
Yeah.
Let's try.
Speaking of experiment, something really important that they didn't tell us about, they wouldn't go into explanation anyway. So there's no corpse runs to go get your experience or coins or anything back.
Because you don't lose them when you die.
Because you don't lose them. But there is some kind of death penalty that we don't know about yet.
They said this is Yasuhiro again, the marketing guy, so take it with a grain of salt, but he says, hey, it's still taking shape, it's very unique, and it's more personal, was his phrasing for what that death penalty is, which is a very interesting tease.
My guess is that it'll start deleting your saves from other games.
I think that's true.
Yeah.
I think that's true.
Yeah.
Dan,
that's what's substantiated. I have no idea what it is.
Walking around From Software's office, did you see Bloodborne 2 anywhere?
I dream about it every night, but I don't think it's in the cards anytime soon. Because
a lot of the Bloodborne leads are working on this game, which is one of those key tells of like, well, maybe it's early in development somewhere, or maybe they divvied it out and there's more devs and leads than we factored in. But
I love all their games, all their modern games anyway. But that is I think it's got to be my favorite universe in all of gaming, and it might start to become my number one game of all time.
It might start to become.
It is slowly climbing up over Zelda Link to the Past over the years here.
Right. How happy were you when Miyazaki walked into the room for that interview and he was wearing a blazer like the one you're wearing right now?
I was like, hey, that's awesome. You know, I was able to, we really were able to bounce off each other thanks to that.
This is really a classy guy. Yeah, cool. Hey, this is an Activision game.
It is.
Yeah.
That's so weird.
I mean, they've been with all kinds of publishers though, so this actually isn't that surprising, right?
It is, and I think on the Dark Souls 3 cover story trip, I think in that interview he made some reference to like, publishers don't really matter too much to us. We just make our From games, and they can sign on or not. And they insisted that like, hey, From has full creative control, but they had an interesting take too of like why they signed up with Activision, where they're like, Activision was the most interested, and they offered the most help on like a user testing basis for better onboarding.
Right. And
You're worried about that?
I think the word onboarding is
the From Software audience doesn't need any onboarding, but I am interested to see what kind of tutorialization comes to light. We got to see hints of it in our play session with like, you know, pop-ups on screen saying, hey, this is your grappling hook cue, and you can throw your thing over here, so give it a try, you know, kind of things like
It's
that.
basically Clippy, popping on.
Which is,
screen.
it's so...
Are you sure you meant to attack that?
I think it was really good. It was really good advice, but at the same time, it's just like wow, people are gonna get torn up. Like it just feels a little. It's a little strange in a From game, but
I can see that
I think
being
it's
a
great.
little intrusive. I think to some players of like, I just want to skip. I know how to play these games already, but I don't. As long as they're not like spoiling major, like, hey, you have a key now. I think you can use it in this door.
Oh yeah, we didn't, and we didn't see anything like
yeah,
that.
So
All
as
right.
long as they're not like that explicit about some of the like the stuff that is nice to be it's cool when it's obscured versus like I didn't know you could roll by pressing the circle button. Like as long as they sort of front load that stuff and say like here's all what you can do, so like now you know and can explore, versus like being super explicit about progression and stuff. I think that's fine.
And from what we saw, that's exactly what it was. It's just like, you know, to make sure your character knows what to do, so you're not 40 hours in and just finding out how to use a dodge. You know, that's dangerous.
Like I don't think Activision is sitting there going like you need to make these bosses easier. People are not going to be able to.
They're definitely not doing that.
Right.
Not based on what we play.
I don't know. Serial beat it first try, which is pretty. He's just so good at
Needs
this
some
game.
tuning.
But that's I think the thing that I don't think is going to happen. I don't think the game is easier. I don't think it's going to like. It's just more. I think there's a difference between like ease of use and like ease of the experience and accessibility, I think.
Yeah, I think so. So cover story for even more details, Dan. Was it a fun one to write?
Tons more details. Yeah, absolutely. It's always great when it lines up with, you know, a series of games that you're passionate about, even though this isn't a direct series. It's going to fall into that basket of the Soulsborne.
A lot of editorial discussions about like what do we call these games collectively as a thing.
Nah, it's a mess. What are you looking forward to throughout the month? Because it's GameInformer.com/Sekiro for a full month of coverage. Cyril, what do you got?
I mean, this next week I think we'll have like a deeper dive on the Butterfly Hag boss that we saw, and that kind of goes through like here's how the combat sort of changes the bosses, which is like the main event. Like those are the main events in From games for me.
Yeah.
And so how that changes, and then like later in the month we'll have like that full Miyazaki interview, which I think is pretty interesting beyond like stuff that is hard to fit in other stories. There's some cool stuff in there.
Yeah, for sure. And then there's even a couple pullouts we'll probably put before that Miyazaki interview that fans, hardcore From fans might be interested in. We also have video interviews now with Miyazaki, of course, because the camera would melt, I believe, if anybody tried to film him.
It's not that he doesn't want to, it's that he can't.
He's desperately trying to get on camera, but the camera just kept tilting away. It's very strange. But anyways, we have video interviews with like the composer, if you're a fan of the music from Bloodborne, Dark Souls 3 in particular, same composer
And that's
here.
another interesting note. Man, I could talk about this game all day, but I shouldn't. Just interesting how they had to make music for things other than boss fights, you know?
Oh, sure.
Because in other From games, usually,
Very silent,
with some very specific exceptions for moments like Ash Lake and other things, there's no soundtrack. It's dead silence until you get to the orchestral boss battle. But now you got music for everything.
Yeah. Artists, designers, we have video interviews going up throughout the month, so definitely check it out. GameInformer.com/Sekiro. Also, we won't Skype in Miyazaki to answer questions like we normally do at the end of the month because Skype would melt down if it heard its voice. But if you have questions about Sekiro, definitely let us know. Podcast@GameInformer.com, and we'll try and answer them on the show.
Yeah.
If you have lingering questions about what we played and what we saw there at the studio. That was just a clip from a larger show called The Game Informer Show. You can find it on iTunes, Google Play, or GameInformer.com. We take the fun opportunities and exclusive information from Game Informer magazine and boil it into a show that airs every Thursday with exclusive cover story information, developer interviews, a lot of fun stuff. So come love games with us.